This is what happened in the Great War, wrote the famous American cartoonist Rube Goldberg in a 1929 cartoon. And now, 11 years later, he continued, there isn't one man in 10,000 who can tell you why it happened. Let's see, what was that war about anyway? Asked one man. Search me, says another. How did it start? It was something about an archduke or something.
As they tried to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, Europeans too were confused and disillusioned about why the war had been fought. The devastation everywhere was testimony to the fact that not a single nation had come out of the war with its hopes realized. On the surface, it was something about an archduke that triggered the war. It happened in Sarajevo, an ancient market town that in 1914 was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austrian throne, paid a goodwill visit to Sarajevo on June 28, 1914. But events did not go as planned. First, a bomb was thrown at the Archduke's car, missing its intended target but injuring 20 bystanders. Then, as the official motorcade continued, a young man holding a gun stepped from the crowd lining the streets. He fired 2 shots, killing the Archduke and his wife. At the royal court in Vienna, the center of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the assassination was interpreted as a threat to the very existence of the empire. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was composed of many feuding nationalities, held together only by the force of the throne. If one group rebelled, the empire's leaders feared that all the rest would quickly follow. Acting on this fear, Austria responded to the assassination by sending its troops to attack the independent state of Serbia, which it believed to be the center of nationalist agitation. A few short weeks later, Europe was embroiled in a war that would last 4.5 years and eventually involve the whole world. Before examining the causes of this war, it is useful to compare the stated goals of the warring countries with the actual outcome.
The Austro-Hungarian Empire was ruled by one of 4 major dynasties that before the war controlled Central and Eastern Europe. All 4 empires entered the war to protect and expand their domains. But by the time the war ended, all 4 dynasties had been toppled and new countries had emerged. In Russia, the Tsar's government, which went to war against Austria to support fellow Slavs in Serbia, was overthrown by revolution in perhaps the most dramatic example of the differences between the aspirations of a government and what it got out of the war. Germany sent its armed forces to battle to establish what it believed to be its rightful place as a major world power, an ambition that ended in defeat and humiliation. Even the victorious French and English, who saw Germany threatening their status as major world powers, suffered losses from which they never fully recovered. Not only were millions of their countrymen killed and their economies shattered, but their colonial empires in Africa and Asia were in turmoil, stirred up by growing independence movements. The United States entered the war 3 years after the fighting had begun. Its expressed hopes that this was the war to end all wars, the war to make the world safe for democracy, were far from realized. How then did it come about that the world was drawn into a war in which 8 million soldiers and millions of civilians lost their lives for reasons that the survivors could not even remember.
At the time of the assassination at Sarajevo, the great powers of Europe were squared off against one another in a pair of hostile alliances, guaranteeing that if any two powers went to war, the rest were likely to follow. For 20 years, the nations of Europe had been engaged in an arms race, each country determined to remain or become stronger than any potential enemy. Underlying all the tensions was the competition among the major European powers to expand their colonial empires. Possessions abroad provided Europe with raw materials and markets, needs that had grown out of the Industrial Revolution, which had also encouraged the spirit of nationalism. Why did the Industrial Revolution stimulate imperialism and nationalism? And how did these forces lead to war? Today, most people take nationalism for granted. They identify themselves primarily as citizens of a particular nation, loyal to that nation and its government. Patriotism, love for one's country and willingness to defend it, is also widely considered a natural and noble sentiment. All the warring nations relied on this sense of patriotism to rally their citizens during World War I. Yet, nationalism as we know it did not even begin to develop until the 19th century. For most of its history, Europe was a cultural patchwork. Each color here indicates a group of people related by language, religion, and customs. This pre-World War I map shows how little national boundary lines related to cultural ties. This was certainly true in Eastern Europe. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, with German-speaking Vienna as its center, included people from very different cultures. Many of them, Poles, Slavs, Czechs, Turks, felt separated from their kinfolk within and outside the empire. Over the centuries, the map of the continent had been drawn and redrawn as kings, princes, and emperors squabbled, negotiated, and fought wars to determine who ruled over what territory. Throughout most of history, the people had neither the right nor the power to choose their rulers. Many accepted the idea that God meant kings and nobles to be at the top of society and the mass of peasants at the bottom. For centuries, the people who worked the land, peasants, had been the bedrock of European society. And well into the 19th century, the overwhelming majority of Europeans were peasants. Hard-working, religious, uneducated, deeply attached to land, family, and village, the peasant labored through the seasons, often on the edge of survival. Life was hard. But there was a certain order and stability to it. This stability gave way, however, as Europe gradually became an uneasy mixture of old and new. Industrialization, which began in England in the 18th century, spread to continental Europe, transforming agricultural societies into urban, industrialized nations. Industrialization did not take place evenly across Europe. While certain areas were heavily industrialized, most Europeans were still working the land as the 20th century began. Wherever it occurred, industrialization had the same impact. As factories multiplied and cities expanded, economic pressure forced more and more peasants off the land. Some sailed to new worlds across the sea, and increasing numbers moved to the cities, hoping to find work. For many, life in the city was not much of an improvement. Struggling for existence without the familiar security the village offered, the poor were among the most discontented of the new city dwellers. For the prosperous, families of merchants, shopkeepers, businessmen, and others, city life was more rewarding. But many members of this new middle class were also dissatisfied. Their freedom to act and to do business as they wished was often hampered by the rules of the old social structure. In fact, hardly anyone in the city fit into a society whose rules assumed that almost everyone was either a noble or a peasant. Many city dwellers supported the concept of democratic government, in which decisions were made by elected representatives. The rule of kings was successfully challenged, and the principles of democracy were applied for the first time toward the end of the 18th century in the American and French revolutions, which linked the goals of democracy and nationalism. The theory was that people who shared in governing themselves could feel part of their nation in a way never before possible, and could be expected to support and defend that nation. Over the next century, the parallel goals of national independence and democratic self-government fired the imagination of millions. In 1830, Greece won freedom from the Ottoman Empire, and Belgium gained independence from the Netherlands. Aroused by Garibaldi, the Italian people during the 1860s were brought together in a single nation. Around the same time, the German-speaking states of Central Europe were united. One empire, one people, one God, says this stamp commemorating the birth of the powerful new German nation. Nationalism was fostered by the spread of mass education. With central governments controlling the schools, children throughout each nation began to read the same history books, to learn the same patriotic songs, to develop a common sense of their culture and traditions. Local customs became less important as a common feeling of national identity took hold. People had always felt a strong attachment to the land, the music, the traditions of their local area. Governments now sought to blend these sentiments with loyalty to the larger nation-state. Heroic moments from the past, glorious battles won, tragic defeats suffered, noble leaders, pious saints, all became part of the national mythology. The desire for an unbeatable army grew as people increasingly identified their own best interest with that of a powerful nation. As governments concentrated mainly on increasing the size and strength of the nation, democracy and nationalism became separate issues. French and German nationalism met head-on in 1870 in the Franco-Prussian War. For the victorious Germans, the war was a source of pride. Their army seemed invincible. The French, however, felt violated, especially by the loss of their rich provinces of Alsace and Lorraine. Soon, the humiliation of defeat became a longing for revenge.
France will have but one thought: to raise her young generation to form an army of the whole people, to become again a great France, the France of 1792, the France of an idea with a sword. Then she will take back Alsace-Lorraine.
This statement from Victor Hugo, one of France's most renowned writers, reflected an important change. The nationalist spirit that had been born as a yearning for liberty was now being used as a justification for war. In the Balkan Peninsula and southeastern Europe, nationalism caused numerous small wars as various peoples in the region sought freedom from the Austro-Hungarian and the Ottoman empires. Independent nations like Serbia, Bulgaria, and Greece wanted to expand their territory, and Russia fanned all the flames by offering itself as protector of its fellow Slavs. Bosnia, annexed by Austria-Hungary from Turkey in 1908, along with Herzegovina, was a focal point of the tension. Neighboring Serbia, a Slavic nation, yearned to join with fellow Slavs in Bosnia and throughout the empire to form one Yugoslav nation. Bosnians looked to Serbia for liberation. In Bosnia, secret nationalist societies turned to acts of violence in their war against the Austrian throne. Princip, the Bosnian student who shot Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo, was a member of one such society.
The main motive which guided me in my deed was the avenging of the Serbian people. I am a nationalist. I aim to free the Yugoslavs, for I am a Yugoslav.
With these words, Princip explained the incident that set the wheels of war in motion. The same nationalist spirit that caused friction between nations enabled the government of each nation to rally its people in support of the approaching war. A difficult task in the face of the strikes and demonstrations that had threatened national unity in the industrialized countries for decades. Workers had gained little from the mid-19th century nationalist uprisings. In most countries, not even the right to vote. But through their unions, they were demanding a fairer share of the benefits of the new technological age. By the turn of the century, workers in many European countries had been attracted to the ideas of socialists, who blamed capitalism, in which industry was privately owned and run for profit, for the poverty and misery of the working people. The socialists argued that the needs of the majority would only be met in a society run by the workers. Socialists urged workers not to think as nationalists, but to ally themselves with their fellow workers in other countries. As international tensions grew, they urged a worldwide alliance of workers against war, which, they argued, would be fought over profits and colonial expansion, and not in the interests of working people. Governments realized they needed the support of the workers in case of war, and they counted on the strength of nationalist sentiment to get it. As war approached, and as patriotic fervor was whipped up within each country, workers were swept along with everybody else. Even most socialists supported their respective governments once the war began. Nationalism, then, contributed to the war in more than one way. It intensified feelings of hostility between nations. It also provided a deep reservoir of patriotic feeling, without which no nation could have sustained the 4.5 long years of grueling battle and slaughter. But nationalism alone did not cause the war. We'll examine the ways in which imperialism fostered the arms race, the alliance system, and ultimately the war.
The years before World War I were a time of peace and growing prosperity for many Europeans. Popular magazines displayed the latest products of an ever-expanding economy. Fascinating items that promised to end drudgery and add excitement to life. Ads urged businessmen to trade in their horse-drawn buggies for motorized trucks. Speed and efficiency were central to this wondrous new age of advanced technology. Europe's wealth rested on two things: its industrial strength and its domination of the rest of the world. This was the golden age of European imperialism. By 1900, European powers owned or controlled most of Africa and Asia, and all or part of every other continent as well. While imperialism was evidence of European strength, it also revealed a basic dependency. Each country's prosperity hinged on its ability to maintain and expand its colonial empire. This created competition among the various imperialist powers for control of foreign territory. Imperialist rivalry is considered a primary cause of World War I.
Around 1880, a mad grab for new colonies began among the European powers. Over the next 20 years, they seized vast areas of the globe, as wealth and power came increasingly to depend on colonial possessions. Britain led the way in this new round of colonial conquest, having long since outstripped all competitors in the contest for colonies and for trade routes that had begun 400 years earlier. For most of the 19th century, Britain was also Europe's leading manufacturing country, as the wealth from its empire promoted rapid industrial expansion. This, in turn, created pressure for further colonization, to provide factories with a constant flow of raw materials unavailable at home, secure markets where manufacturers could sell their products, and safe places for them to invest their growing wealth. India helped fulfill these needs. Britain had long been dominant in India through the British East India Company. Following a series of uprisings in the 1850s, the British government actually seized control, and the vast subcontinent of ancient civilizations became the centerpiece of the British Empire. In Africa, Britain faced competition from other European powers, whose appetite for colonies expanded as their industries grew. Only 10% colonized in 1880, Africa was 90% under European control by 1900. Britain and France grabbed the largest shares, with the rest left to Spain, Portugal, Belgium, Italy, and Germany. In Asia, China was the biggest remaining prize. Here, the once powerful Manchu dynasty was losing its grip on the world's most populous nation. The imperialist powers struggled among themselves for shares of the lucrative China trade. By 1900, most of Asia was controlled by one European power or another, either through outright colonization or through treaties creating spheres of influence, which granted the holder the right to exclusive economic exploitation. From then on, with Asia and Africa divided among them, any territorial gain on the part of one power could only be made at the expense of another. And Britain was the envy of all the other imperialist powers. A nation of some 40 million inhabitants in 1900, Britain ruled an empire with 10 times that population, covering territory almost 100 times as great as Britain itself. With colonies stretching over huge areas of every continent, the British could rightfully boast that the sun never sets on the British Empire. Middle-class British families could relax over their afternoon tea, secure in the knowledge that Britain's huge empire, its well-developed industry, and its all-powerful navy guaranteed their safety and comfort. The history of tea illustrates many aspects of imperialism. A favorite drink in the Orient for centuries, tea was introduced in Europe around 1600 by Dutch and British traders. These were the early days of imperialism, when in some parts of the world, European countries sought to monopolize trade rather than establish colonies. As trade expanded, tea continued to grow in popularity, although even in the 18th century, it was a luxury. The palatial offices of the British East India Company in London reflected the wealth derived from this trade. The company was powerful enough to pressure the British Parliament to pass a series of measures in 1773, assuring its monopoly of the tea trade. This monopoly had repercussions in the empire. It caused anger in the American colonies and encouraged their rebellion against the British crown. The 13 colonies, however, were of far less concern to the British than their holdings in India. And tea figured prominently in India's importance. By the late 19th century, after Britain's conquest of India, tea was no longer a luxury. Big tea companies now owned huge plantations in India and Ceylon. Using modern machinery and technology, and with an unlimited supply of cheap labor, tea companies could mass-produce tea and sell it cheaply. For the millions of Britons beginning to appreciate it for the first time, tea was a daily reminder of the higher standard of living that imperialism was providing. Some questioned the morality of a prosperity based on imperialism. Was it right, they asked, that one nation's wealth be based on the exploitation of so many millions around the world? That so much of a poor country's fertile land be set aside to grow products for export? While periodic famines took millions of Indian lives? But most Britons believed imperialism to be both necessary and noble. Like other imperialists, they believed their culture to be superior to that of their subject peoples. To them, colonial rule was bringing the blessings of civilization to the backward peoples of the world. Medicine, transportation, administration, and often Christianity. Many saw colonial rule as a mission, a responsibility, what the British poet Rudyard Kipling called the white man's burden. Imperialist rivalry caused numerous localized disputes, wars, and skirmishes around the turn of the century.
Japan and China over Korea and Formosa. The United States and Britain over Venezuela. Britain and France over the Sudan. Spain and the United States over Cuba and the Philippines. Britain and the Dutch colonists over South Africa. Germany and France over Morocco. Russia and Japan over Manchuria.
Japan's victory in the 1905 Russo-Japanese War was a humiliating defeat for the huge but backward Russian Empire. For the first time in modern history, a European power had been defeated by a non-European nation. Russia's century-long eastward expansion into Asia had been checked. Japan was on the rise. The effects of these conflicts were threatening the balance of power in Europe. Germany, a latecomer in the rivalry for colonies, was beginning to test its strength. Determined to industrialize rapidly and build its military strength, Germany in the early 1900s passed Britain as the major European producer of iron and steel, the most critical industrial products. But when it came to colonial possessions, Germany remained a second-rate power, unable to make much headway against the British and French. Frustrated by this conflict between industrial might and territorial inferiority, Germany felt it increasingly necessary to challenge its imperialist rivals. In 1911, a dispute broke out between Germany and France as Kaiser Wilhelm II sought to block France from gaining complete control of the Moroccan port of Agadir. Wilhelm yearned to establish Germany as a great world power and decided to embark on an ambitious program of naval expansion, challenging Britain's long-standing supremacy of the seas. Britain, determined to remain ahead, increased production too. Soon, the two nations were spending huge sums of money in their rivalry for superior naval strength. This contest was only one part of a continuing buildup of arms and armies going on throughout Europe. Everywhere, factories turned out weapons of incredible destructiveness. The military inspired near reverence, and its leaders played prominent roles in the governments of most nations. This military buildup soon developed a momentum of its own. Each nation wanted to remain one step ahead of its potential enemies. Yet every new weapon added to one nation's arsenal, every new division added to its army, was quickly matched and bettered in this endless cycle. Once the process had started, no nation felt it could afford to stop. The arms race took place along with a developing system of alliances that started in 1879, when Germany allied itself with Austria-Hungary. Italy joined 3 years later in what was called the Triple Alliance. Alarmed at Germany's growing strength, Russia and France signed a counter-alliance in 1894. Tsar Nicholas II, ruler of Europe's most notorious autocracy, was welcomed as a hero in Paris, birthplace of Europe's democratic tradition. Britain had always been reluctant to form alliances, preferring to follow a policy of splendid isolation, relying for protection on its navy and on the balance of power among the feuding nations of Europe. But by the turn of the century, even mighty Britain was worried by Germany's growing strength. This worry led Britain early in the century to reach agreement with France and Russia against Germany and its allies. In every country, military leaders began mapping battle plans, just in case. Was a major war inevitable?
Certainly, I think so, said France's top general. It will come. I shall fight it, and I shall win.
This was the mood in Europe. When, in Sarajevo, a Slavic nationalist murdered the heir to the Austrian throne. Austria, desperate to save its empire, decided to move against Serbia, where nationalist agitation seemed to be centered. As Serbians hurried to defend their country, Russia pledged to support her Slavic cousins against Austria. Germany promised to aid Austria if Russia intervened, while the French prepared to back up their Russian ally. As the system of alliances came into play, mobilization orders went out all across Europe. Finally, on July 28, 1914, Austria declared war against Serbia. One by one, the nations of Europe picked up their weapons. The spirit of nationalism had heightened tensions between nations, while firing the patriotic passions within each nation. The intensive arms race had encouraged each nation to equate its preservation with its military strength, creating a mood in which war seemed inevitable. The alliance system had virtually guaranteed that if a war erupted, it would engulf all of Europe. And at the root of it all was the fierce competition among the imperial powers to realize their national dreams by gaining control of the world's resources. The war, which became truly worldwide when the United States entered combat in April 1917, changed the world. At its start, British Foreign Minister Sir Edward Grey said, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our time." And he was right. Europe never regained its dominant place in the world. Out of the ashes of the war rose a fearsome totalitarian movement that in 20 short years would lead to another, more terrible war.